Xian didn't remember the first time he killed. That memory was gone, lost somewhere beneath layers of cold erasure. What he did remember, at least for brief moments, was the feeling, the small splashes of emotion he had learned to repress or forget. Anger. Fear. Triumph. Guilt. They came in flashes, like echoes of a life that no longer belonged to him. But Xian never questioned it. He was the perfect weapon. The first time he saw the mission briefing, he didn't think about it. He couldn't. His mind was always wiped clean, as if none of it mattered. The world was a blur, a rush of faces, voices, objectives, and enemies. They told him what to do, and he did it. No questions asked. The mission was simple. Retrieve a classified document from a secure facility. Eliminate all hostiles. It didn't seem particularly special, but for Xian, nothing ever did. His training was so ingrained that his body moved before his mind could catch up, his every action mechanical, driven by the instincts drilled into him over countless operations. The soldier in him didn't think, it just acted. The cold steel of his knife slid silently into the man's throat. No struggle, no resistance. The target didn't even have time to scream. A body dropped to the floor, and Xian stepped over it, continuing forward like a well-oiled machine. Another body. Another successful mission. Another moment where he remembered nothing and everything at once, but this mission, this time, something was different. His hand shook slightly as he wiped the blood off his blade. He had never felt it before, this tremor in his fingers. Xian, report, a voice crackled in his earpiece. He stood still for a moment, just long enough to wonder if the voice had called to him. Did they always call to him? The voice continued, Xian, you've completed the objective. Proceed to the extraction point. Xian blinked, shaking his head. He knew the mission, but for the first time, the words sounded hollow. Why was he shaking? Why did he feel this sudden unease? He stepped forward, but something gnawed at the back of his mind, something nagging at him. It was like a fleeting memory, a moment that he couldn't quite grasp. Xian, report. He inhaled sharply, his body freezing in place. This was not supposed to happen. This was not supposed to be part of the plan. His mind went blank, a familiar coldness beginning to settle in. It was as if something was missing. A connection. A meaning that he had done this before. Hadn't he? It didn't matter. He wasn't supposed to think. He was supposed to kill, complete the mission, and erase whatever emotions these fleeting memories were trying to stir in him, but his fingers trembled again, and for the first time in his life, Xian felt the pull of something deeper. Something human. He wasn't just the perfect soldier. He wasn't just the perfect weapon. He was something else, something hidden beneath the training, beneath the erasures. Xian, the voice yelled, but it was distant, muffled. Xian reached up to press the button on his comm device, but he hesitated. Something was wrong. The voices, the commands, they didn't make sense. Suddenly, the world spun around him. His vision blurred as the memories flooded in. A flash. A young boy in a park, laughing. A woman calling his name, tender and soft. A face he didn't recognize but felt like his own. Another flash, a hospital bed, a needle being pushed into his arm, an intense pain. And then, silence. The world around him snapped back into focus. Xian was standing in the middle of the hallway, the mission completed, his knife still gripped in his hand. His heart was pounding. Sweat dripped down his brow. His hand shook. Xian, the voice broke through again, but this time it wasn't as cold, as mechanical. It was laced with concern. What's going on? It was then that Xian realized the truth. The world wasn't what he thought it was. He wasn't just a soldier. He wasn't just an experiment. He was something else. Something human. And he remembered, no, felt, that this wasn't the first time he had asked himself these questions. The realization hit him like a bolt of lightning, and just as suddenly, the world around him froze. His mind went blank again, and everything went dark. The next thing Cien knew, he was back in his cell. The walls were white, sterile. The harsh, fluorescent light above hummed softly. He was naked. He was clean. His wounds were gone. There was nothing to remind him of the mission, nothing to remind him of the blood on his hands. He wasn't surprised. This was how it always was. Every mission ended the same way. His memories erased. His emotions scrubbed clean, but this time, there was something different. Cien stood in the center of the room, waiting. He could feel it, his heart pounding in his chest, his palms damp. He wasn't sure why. His training told him to wait for orders, but something inside him was telling him that this time, he wasn't going to obey. He stood still for a long time, his mind racing. He could hear the soft hum of the ventilation system. The sound was so familiar, it should have comforted him. But it didn't. It only made the silence feel heavier. The door opened, and Dr. May walked in. She was the only one who ever spoke to him like he was, like he was something more than just a tool. "Cien," she said, her voice soft but urgent, "we need to talk." He didn't answer at first. He just looked at her. There was something in her eyes, something that made him feel seen. And for the first time in years, he wanted to speak. To ask. To understand. He started, his voice thick and unfamiliar. "I remember." Dr. May's eyes widened. "You remember?" He nodded, still unsure. "I remember. I remember a life before this. A family. A name. I remember feeling things. Emotions. It wasn't always like this. I wasn't always this." "Cien," she said, her voice trembling. "I can't imagine what this must be like for you. But you need to understand something. The memories, they're not real. Not anymore. You've been altered, engineered. You were made for this." "No," he said, his voice harder now. "I was made to forget. I was made to be nothing but a weapon. But I remember. I remember." Dr. May shook her head, stepping closer. "Cien, you don't know what you're saying. If you remember, if you feel, I don't care what they've done to me," he interrupted, his fists clenched. "I don't care if I'm broken or if I was built to kill. I'm not just a weapon. I'm a person." The room fell into silence as Cien's words lingered in the air, heavy and raw. For a moment, Dr. May didn't speak. She simply looked at him, her expression unreadable. Then, she said softly, "I never wanted this for you. But you're right. You're not just a weapon. You're something more. Something human." Cien felt a flicker of hope, but it was quickly extinguished by the cold, oppressive truth. He had been a part of this system, a product of it, and now that he had broken free from it, now that he knew what he had lost, he didn't know if he could ever go back. "I have to know the truth," he said. "I have to know who I really am." Dr. May sighed, her shoulders slumping. "The truth is not something we can undo, Cien. You were created to be a soldier. But maybe, just maybe, you can break free." Cien didn't know what that meant. He didn't know what breaking free would look like. All he knew was that he wasn't going to be a weapon anymore. But as he stared into Dr. May's eyes, he realized something. His battle had only just begun. Cien stared at Dr. May for what felt like an eternity, the air between them thick with unspoken words. She was the first person to ever look at him as if he were something more than an experiment, something beyond the cold, calculated destruction that he was engineered to be. He had been built to kill, yes, but what if there was more? What if, deep down, beneath the layers of training and erasure, there was something that deserved to be acknowledged? "I need to know everything," he said, his voice steadied despite the storm of thoughts whirling through his mind. I need to know what they've done to me. Dr. May hesitated, biting her lip as if weighing the consequences of revealing the truth. You have to understand, Sien. You were never meant to remember. They designed you to be a perfect weapon, a soldier with no attachment, no emotional ties. They wiped your memories over and over again to keep you that way. He shook his head, his fingers curling into fists. But I do remember. I remember bits and pieces, flashes of a life I was supposed to forget. His breath hitched, and he pressed his palm against his forehead, trying to steady himself. Why was I created like this? Why couldn't I just have been normal? Dr. May's expression softened, and she took a tentative step forward. Normal, she repeated, almost to herself. What is normal? You were born with the potential to be so much more. They saw that in you, even before they started the experiments. But they didn't want a person. They wanted a weapon. Sien's chest tightened. So what am I now? A weapon that remembers too much? No, she whispered, shaking her head. You're more than that. You can be more than that. But you have to make a choice. And it's not going to be easy. The words hit Sien with a force that left him reeling. A choice. What kind of choice was she talking about? He had been told what to do his entire life. He had been programmed to follow orders, to kill, to never question. But now? Now, he didn't know what to believe. His mind raced, and before he could stop himself, he blurted, "What happened to my family? Where are they?" Dr. May flinched, a shadow passing over her face. Sien, you don't have a family anymore. She stopped herself, clearly struggling with what to say next. What they did to you, what they did to everyone in the program, it's irreversible. He clenched his jaw, fighting the rush of emotions that threatened to overtake him. Family. That word felt foreign on his tongue, yet there was something undeniably right about it, something that connected to the parts of him he couldn't erase. A surge of loss hit him, sharp and painful. But he pushed it away. He had no time for weakness. No time to mourn what could never be. I don't care about that, he said, his voice hardening. I care about who I am now. About what I'm supposed to do with this. He gestured to his body, as though trying to distance himself from the very thing he had become. Dr. May stepped closer, placing a hand on his arm. Sien, you were never meant to be the weapon they created you to be. You are human. You have the ability to feel, to think, to choose your own path. She paused, her gaze searching his. But it's going to take everything you have to break free from their control. They won't let you go easily. Sien's heart pounded in his chest. He had never been allowed to choose anything for himself. All his life, he had been a tool, an instrument of war, of violence. There was no room for choice in that. But now? Now, he didn't know who he was without it. He could feel the weight of his choices pressing on him, each one more difficult than the last. What do I do? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. You fight, Dr. May said, her voice firm. You fight back. You find the truth about yourself. You find the answers. You make sure that no one else has to live like this. Sien looked at her, searching for any sign of hesitation, any doubt. But all he saw was conviction, pure, unshakable conviction. For the first time in his life, someone was standing beside him, not as a scientist, not as an authority figure, but as an ally. As someone who believed in him. And that belief, for reasons he couldn't fully comprehend, felt like the strongest weapon he had ever known. The next few days were a blur of planning and preparation. Dr. May had worked quickly to gather information, digging through hidden files, looking for any trace of the truth. Sien found himself growing increasingly restless, the urge to take action gnawing at him. Every time he closed his eyes, he could see fragments of his past, his family, his home, a life that had been stolen from him. He wanted to fight for that life, to reclaim it, but the path ahead was clouded with uncertainty. They couldn't stay in the facility much longer. Cien knew that. The lab would eventually notice that something was wrong. They would come for him, and they wouldn't stop until he was back under their control. He couldn't let that happen. Not after everything he had learned. Not after everything he had begun to feel that it was time to leave. Dr. May, I'm ready, he said one morning, as he paced back and forth in his cell. His nerves were taut, his mind racing. Let's do it. She nodded, a look of determination in her eyes. We have one chance at this, Cien. If we're going to escape, we need to do it now. We'll head for the lower levels. There's a way out, an underground passage, but it's heavily guarded. We have to get there before they realize we're gone. Cien nodded, his muscles tense with anticipation. This was it. The moment that would decide everything. There was no turning back now. The door to his cell slid open, and Dr. May stepped inside, holding a small device in her hand. It was a keycard, a tool they would need to bypass the security systems. She handed it to him, her fingers brushing his as she did. Are you ready? She asked, her voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. That he nodded. Ready. They moved quickly, slipping through the hallways of the facility, their footsteps muffled against the sterile floors. Cien's heart beat in his chest, each thud a reminder of how far he had come, from the soldier he had been to the man he was becoming. It wasn't just about escaping anymore. It was about claiming his humanity, about taking back what had been stolen from him. As they reached the door to the underground passage, Cien felt a sense of finality. There was no going back. They were leaving everything behind. The door slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into the darkness. Dr. May stepped ahead of him, her voice barely a whisper as she said, "This is it, Cien. We're not just leaving the facility. We're leaving everything we know behind. There's no more safety, no more security. This is where we make our stand." Cien took a deep breath, his mind focused, his body ready. "I'm with you." Together, they descended into the depths of the underground tunnels, their footsteps echoing in the silence. The world they knew was about to be left behind, but ahead of them lay a future, uncertain, dangerous, but free. The journey through the underground tunnels was long and treacherous. The air was thick with dust, and the walls seemed to close in on them as they moved deeper into the facility's bowels. Cien's senses were heightened, his body on high alert, every muscle taut and ready for action. Suddenly, they heard footsteps ahead of them. Cien's heart rate spiked, but he didn't hesitate. He drew his weapon, his fingers steady as he prepared for the inevitable confrontation. "We need to move fast," Dr. May whispered, her voice tight with urgency. Cien nodded. They couldn't afford to be caught now. Not when they were so close. They crept forward, their footsteps muffled by the concrete floors, until they reached the entrance to the security checkpoint. A guard stood just outside, his back turned. Cien's breath caught in his throat. "Wait for my signal," Dr. May murmured. Cien held his breath as Dr. May subtly activated a small device. The guard's comm device beeped, and he turned his back to check it. In that split second, Cien moved. He was on the guard before he had time to react, his hand wrapping around the man's throat and pulling him into the shadows. Without a sound, the guard crumpled to the floor. Dr. May let out a breath of relief. "Good work." Cien didn't respond. He didn't need to. He was already moving again, his body trained to act without hesitation. Together, they continued through the dark corridors, ever closer to the freedom that awaited them. Cien's mind was filled with the uncertainty of what lay ahead. Would he ever be truly free? Could he escape the chains of his past and embrace the man he had the potential to be? He didn't know. But what he did know was that this fight, this struggle, was his choice. And for the first time in his life, that was all that mattered. Cien's every step felt heavier as he and Dr. May navigated the labyrinth of tunnels beneath the facility. The dim light from their makeshift flashlights barely illuminated the walls, their cold, gray surfaces a reminder of the starkness of the world they were leaving behind. They moved quickly, quietly, with the weight of everything they had lost and everything they hoped to gain pushing them forward. Every sound, every creak of metal, sent adrenaline coursing through his veins, his senses sharp, his body ready for anything. They had made it past the first security checkpoint, but the deeper they went, the more dangerous it became. The labyrinth was not just a series of tunnels, it was the very heart of the facility's security system. Patrols moved through it like clockwork, their voices echoing faintly as they passed. Cien had no illusions about how close they were to being caught, but he couldn't afford to be distracted by the fear. This was no longer just about escaping. It was about reclaiming a life that had been stolen from him and breaking free from the system that had turned him into a tool. They rounded a corner, and Dr. May held up a hand to signal for him to stop. The sound of footsteps grew louder, closer. Cien froze, his back pressed against the cold concrete wall, muscles tense as the guards approached. Dr. May's face was pale under the harsh light of the tunnel, but her eyes were focused. She activated another small device, some kind of jammer, and the lights above flickered for a moment, plunging the tunnel into darkness. It was enough. The guards, momentarily disoriented, fumbled to adjust their vision, and Cien moved swiftly, silently. He grabbed the first guard from behind, covering his mouth with one hand, and with the other, he twisted the man's neck in one smooth motion. The guard crumpled to the floor, unconscious, as Cien let his body slump against the wall. The second guard barely had time to react before Dr. May's device zapped him with an electrical shock that left him dazed. He staggered, his body jerking with spasms, and Cien was already on him, pinning him to the ground before he could call for backup. They had no time to waste. The longer they lingered, the greater the chance they would be discovered. They moved quickly, dragging the unconscious guards into a small maintenance room and locking the door behind them. Dr. May wiped her brow, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "We're almost there, Cien. Just a little further." Cien nodded, though he didn't know how much further a little was. The tunnels were a maze, and though Dr. May seemed to know where she was going, every turn they took seemed to bring them closer to the heart of the facility. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the air became, thick with the scent of metal and machinery. He could hear the faint hum of generators, the low drone of the facility's operations, sounds he had long learned to ignore. But now, every noise felt like an alarm, a countdown to when their escape would be discovered. They stopped at another intersection. This one was different, a wider space, with more equipment and less cover. The security cameras would be active here, and the guards more alert. Cien glanced at Dr. May, silently asking for the next move. She didn't hesitate. She had worked for the facility, studied its systems, and she knew its weaknesses. She handed Cien a small device, similar to the ones she'd used to jam the lights. It was a sensor disruptor, capable of scrambling the security cameras for a short window of time. She leaned in close, whispering urgently, "We have 10 seconds. You know what to do." Cien took the device and nodded, turning toward the corridor where he could already hear the footsteps of a patrol rounding the corner. His body moved with a practiced ease, a perfect blend of muscle and instinct. He hit the button on the device, and the world around him flickered. The cameras blinked out, leaving the hall shrouded in temporary darkness. "Go," Dr. May urged, her voice low but firm. Cien darted forward, his eyes sharp, his focus absolute. He could hear the guards approaching, 2 of them, their footsteps heavy, their voices low as they spoke in a language he didn't understand. Cien moved like a shadow, slipping past them just as they turned the corner. It was a dangerous gamble, but it paid off. The guards didn't see him. They passed by, unaware, their conversations continuing as if nothing was out of place. They were close now, closer than ever. But there was a gnawing feeling in the pit of Cien's stomach, a feeling that he couldn't quite shake. It was as if something was watching them, waiting for the moment they would slip up. He knew the facility too well. The system, the lab, it was built on control, on making sure nothing ever went wrong. But for the first time, Cien felt like the system was failing. It was a terrifying thought, but also an exhilarating one. Dr. May motioned for him to follow as she stepped into the final corridor. This one was quieter. Darker. There was no sign of movement, no more patrols or cameras. They were almost to the exit, just a little further, she whispered again, and this time, Cien could hear the edge of anxiety in her voice. She had been so confident before, but now, even she felt the pressure. They reached the heavy steel door at the end of the hall. A loud clang echoed as Dr. May inserted a keycard into the panel, the door creaking as it began to slide open. Cien could see the faint outline of the exit ahead of them, a way out. A chance at freedom, but just as they were about to step through, a voice rang out from behind them, "Hold it right there." Cien spun around, heart pounding in his chest. Two soldiers stood at the far end of the hall, weapons drawn, their eyes locked on him. He didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, placing himself between Dr. May and the guards, his body coiled and ready for the fight. "Cien, no." Dr. May's voice was desperate, but he didn't listen. There was no time for hesitation now. There was only action. The first soldier fired, the shot echoing through the corridor. Cien was already moving, his body instinctively dodging the blast and closing the distance between them. He reached the first guard before the second could react, grabbing the man's arm and twisting it until he dropped his weapon. Cien's fist connected with the soldier's face, sending him to the ground with a sickening thud. The second soldier hesitated, just for a second. That was all Cien needed. He launched himself forward, disarming the guard with a swift motion, knocking the gun out of his hands. The soldier scrambled backward, fear evident in his eyes. "Don't make this harder," Cien growled, his voice low and cold, but the soldier wasn't done. He reached for his comm device, his fingers trembling as he tried to send an alert. Cien didn't give him the chance. With a single, brutal strike, he incapacitated the soldier, knocking him unconscious before he could make another move. Breathing heavily, Cien turned back to Dr. May, who had been watching in wide-eyed shock. Her hands were shaking, but she didn't say anything. There was no time for words now. "Go," Cien said, nodding toward the open door. "It's time to finish this." Together, they stepped through the threshold into the outside world. For the first time in what felt like forever, Cien breathed deeply, feeling the cool air of freedom fill his lungs. The sky above was dark, the stars barely visible behind a blanket of clouds. But he didn't care. He was free. And as long as he kept moving, no one could take that away from him. He turned to Dr. May, who was staring at him, a mixture of awe and fear in her eyes. "Where do we go now?" Cien asked, his voice steady. She looked at him, her gaze unflinching. "Now we find out who we really are." And with that, they disappeared into the night, the facility fading into the distance behind them.